Do you want any hot dogs? Or just macaroni?
Just macaroni.
The McQuarries of Waseca are like most families with 2 kids and dual working parents. School, work, church, and school activities make up the routine. Nothing unusual for these Wasecans. But there's this one thing.
Why Waseca? we get that question all the time, yes.
6 years ago, these native Oregonians packed up their bags from Portland and moved 1,700 miles due east to here.
My cousin Taya and I grew up together. We were kind of like sisters. She met a boy from Morristown, Minnesota, but he was living in Oregon at the time. They got married and ended up moving back here to Minnesota. And so Mike and I used to come visit them. And every time we would come, I would feel like this is such a wonderful community to be in.
She and husband Mike started to compare their city life to what their life could be like in rural Minnesota.
Good passes, guys.
Mike was a home brewer who wanted to open a farm brewery. Amy worked in healthcare and began to see the big picture.
On one of our vacations during the winter about 6 years ago, my wife decided she was going to apply for a job here in Minnesota on vacation. And I thought she was crazy because we're not moving to Minnesota.
She got the job and they made friends, including someone who knew about growing hops. And everything clicked.
I love Portland. I love the breweries. For me, it was too big. The traffic was awful. The cost of living was high. We didn't really have a sense of belonging to a community.
Researchers say the McQuarries are an example of what is actually happening in rural Minnesota. People are moving in.
The narrative around our small towns is terrible. It's very negative. It's based on what we had or could have had or should have had, and rarely based on what we've got and we find around us here today. So we've got people who are actually choosing to move in. Despite some of the real struggles our small towns have been through over the past 40, 50 years, people are still choosing to move in to our small towns for what they are today and what they will be tomorrow.
Winchester and others are working on a study that looks at what he calls a brain gain in rural Minnesota. It will be published in a few months. They looked at a quarter of all rural Minnesota counties and people who had moved there in the last 5 years. Some of the key findings are more people in their 30s and 40s are moving in. These newcomers bring a lot of skills and knowledge, and they're looking for a slower pace of life, affordability, and good schools. Megan Dayton at the Minnesota State Demographic Center looked at people moving to Minnesota from other states. Unsurprisingly, the Metro gets a fair share of those newcomers. But according to the census, so does Greater Minnesota.
Between 110 and 120,000 people move from other states to Minnesota every year. About 45,000 of those people move to Greater Minnesota. In any given year, about 30% of all people who move from another state to Minnesota are Minnesota-born people. So that leaves 70% of the people who are moving into our state from a different state were not born here.
Winchester says Greater Minnesotans often unknowingly give subtle cues to newcomers.
The first thing newcomers hear when they move to a town is like, why would you move here? And that tells a lot about not just how that town expresses itself through that one individual, but also how that person is now going to experience that place.
In Waseca, leaders want to make sure newcomers feel welcomed.
Something that our chamber is going to start is kind of a Waseca 101 for either people who are moving to the community or even people who live out of town that work in the community. What should you know about Waseca and how can you get involved? And we want to embrace you as a new community member, whether you're living here or working here.
Waseca has about 9,000 people. We asked local Wasecans why they like living here.
Waseca has pretty much everything you need, and if there's something, that's not here, Mankato's not far.
My husband and I love the small town feel, but yet still have a few more amenities.
We've got a lot of fantastic businesses that have come to light. If people would stop in for a while, they'd find out it's a great place to be.
The McQuarries say they have no regrets.
How welcoming has it been? I would say overall very welcoming. I mean, we've had some bumps in the road.
They had to educate their neighbors that a farm brewery wasn't a bar or roadhouse out in the country. Eventually, they won people over.
Even though they were against what we wanted to do, all the people that live out here were supporting each other. And we felt that that was something that was great about the Waseca community, is that they all supported each other.